Hi, friends. Today I want to talk about paper and how important it is as a fountain pen user. When I first started getting into fountain pens, I was absolutely clueless about what it entails, besides the fact that I'll be using a different kind of pen than I'm used to. I've used gel pens exclusively since sometime around 2015, and with my pen case containing nothing but a few Stabilo highlighters and Muji 0.38 gel pens, pretty much any notebook did the job just fine for me. As I ventured into the world of fountain pens, I found that not all papers were created equally. Of course, I was aware that there are different kinds of papers, different thickness, different textures, different colors, and all that. But I didn't know that not all papers were fountain pen friendly, and so I fell into the rabbit hole of papers and notebooks. I know a lot of people may have been discouraged from using fountain pens because the pens didn't write how they expected it to. But what a lot of people don't realize is the problem wasn't with their pens, it was with the papers they use. It was the same for me. After much research about papers and notebooks, watching endless contents, lurking subreddits, and trying out any notebook I came across, I wanted to share with you a few things I've learned through my endless quest to explore the world of papers and notebooks, cheap or expensive. So that's what I'm going to be nerding out about today. There are a few things that are very important to me when selecting the right paper or notebook: feathering, ghosting, bleed-through, and the paper's texture and coating. Let's talk about all of these a little bit. Feathering happens when the ink spreads out on the paper in little fuzzy lines instead of staying nice and crisp. So instead of clean, sharp letters, you get these slightly blurry edges, like the ink is bleeding into the paper fibers. It kind of looks like tiny veins or feathers coming off of your writing, which is where the name comes from. It usually happens when the paper you're using is really absorbent, or if you're using a super inky pen, like a broad nib or a really wet flowing ink. The paper just can't handle that much ink, so it soaks it in and spreads it out. Using flex nibs on absorbent papers can also result in extreme feathering, where you can hardly read your handwriting anymore, as flex nib pens tend to lay down heavy lines of ink and tends to pool at the start or end of a stroke, especially if you pause mid-stroke. When using flex nib pens, even inks that seem moderately wet in regular pens can gush, so if you're using the wrong kind of paper, then ink feathering will be inevitable. Ghosting is when you can see your writing from the other side of the page, but the ink hasn't actually soaked through. It's like the shadow of your writing. You can tell something's there, but you can still write on the reverse side if it doesn't bother you. It happens a lot with really thin paper, especially if you're using dark inks or a juicy pen. Some people love thicker paper because ghosting bothers them. Personally, I quite like a bit of ghosting because it makes my papers and notebooks feel a bit well-loved, well-used. I don't know. I just like it, but not to an extreme, of course. I can't quite use the reverse page if the ghosting gets too extreme now, can I? Bleed-through, on the other hand, is when the ink actually soaks through the paper and shows up on the reverse side. Sometimes it leaves little dots or smudges. That usually means the paper just isn't handling the ink well. It's either too thin, too absorbent, or both. Now let me note here that thinness and cheap price don't always mean the ink will bleed through the paper. There are really well-made papers that are very thin, yet are incredibly resistant to bleed through. One very well-known example would be the Tomoe River paper, which is the same paper you would find in the famous Hobonichi notebooks and planners. And there are also expensive notebooks that perform terribly in terms of bleed-through. Now let's talk about coating and texture, or tooth. Different papers are made with different textures. This is basically how smooth or rough or toothy the paper feels when you run your hand or pen over it. Different coatings also affect how ink behaves on paper. Smooth paper, like Rhodia or Tomoe River, allows your nib to glide across the page, and the ink sits nicely on the surface, so it doesn't spread or feather. It's great for clean lines and ink shading or sheening. Rough or toothy paper, like Midori MD cotton or Life Noble Note, has more texture. You can feel and hear the feedback from your nib when you write. It can also suck up ink more quickly and make the colors just a little bit duller. Coated paper like Clairefontaine or Rhodia helps ink sit on top of the page longer, so it doesn't feather or bleed. The inks tend to be more vibrant and crisp, but the dry time can be slower, so smudging is more likely if you're not careful. Uncoated or lightly coated paper like Midori MD paper strikes a nice balance. It absorbs ink just enough to dry reasonably fast, but still gives you good sharpness and shading. That being said, a lot of uncoated paper can be too absorbent and would not make for good paper to use with fountain pens at all. Now, when I choose the paper or notebook to use with my fountain pens, the main thing I consider is, what will I be using this for? My preference for paper coating and texture varies greatly depending on the purpose of the notebook or paper I'm using. If I'm picking a notebook to use as my bullet journal, ink properties like shading or sheening hardly matter to me, but the important part is that the paper must be resistant to feathering and bleed through. So that's the only thing I would take into consideration. In fact, the notebook I use for my current bullet journal is a hardcover notebook I got for less than 80 baht, with 100 GSM paper that is surprisingly very resistant to feathering and bleed through. My absolute favorite paper for long writing sessions is the Midori MD paper, because I love the subtle toothiness it has, all while still performing great in terms of showing ink properties like shading or sheening, and without feathering or bleed through. But when it comes to my ink journal, where I swatch ink in my collection, my go-to paper is definitely the Tomoe River paper, as it's super smooth and coated in a way that allows every ink property to shine. It's also very resistant to bleed through, so unless I'm dumping a whole bunch of ink onto the page, even my heavy swabs don't bleed through the paper, despite how thin this paper is. If you want to know about what notebook I use for what, check out my video on my current notebook system. Now let's talk about well-loved papers. There are a few that are well-loved among fountain pen enthusiasts out there, like Tomoe River, Rhodia, Clairefontaine, Midori MD paper, Maruma Nemesine, and the list goes on. Most of these will be priced higher than your typical notebooks you're used to just grabbing off of shelves in your local stationery shops. And if you're just getting into fountain pens, you might be surprised at how expensive some of these can be. That being said, there are some budget-friendly options out there. The ones I've tried are Muji notebooks, Kokuyo campus notebooks, and Daiso premium notebooks. I do have to caution that the Muji paper quality varies. For the most part, if the label says made in Japan or high-quality paper, it's usually a pretty safe bet, though it's more prone to feathering depending on your ink and pen of choice. There are likely more local options that would also be available to you that I have no idea about, depending on where you are. For recommendations on locally available fountain pen-friendly papers and notebooks, I would highly recommend checking out the subreddits r/notebooks, r/fountain pens, and r/journaling. If you search for your city or country name in the search bar in these subreddits, you might find some recommendations from fountain pen enthusiasts in your local area. I'm personally exploring locally made notebooks that I have access to as well, and I'll definitely be posting about them in the future. I currently have a running series on my TikTok and Instagram reviewing notebooks and papers, and I'll definitely turn them into long-form videos to post here too. Hopefully, my posts will be helpful to those who are finding their perfect fountain pen-friendly notebooks. If you want to see those, please consider subscribing so that you'll be notified when I post a new video. Thank you so much for listening to me nerd out about papers and notebooks. If you have any questions or recommendations yourselves, please feel free to leave them in the comments. That's all for today. Bye!